Uh, I'm Salif Nimaga with the DMNE unit of PBF, PBSO, and also focal point for a number of African countries.
I'm Barit Karash. I'm managing the overall GYPI process at PBF and PBSO.
And finally, I'm Tammy Smith, heading up the DMNE sort of team that we have here at the Peacebuilding Fund, and also managing a number of countries as well as global processes.
Comme d'habitude, on va faire cet exercice encore une fois en anglais, mais pour ceux qui veuillent bien parler avec nous en français, c'est possible de poser des questions en français dans le chat et on va essayer de les répondre après la présentation en français également si vous voulez. Okay, then I think we're good to go. First of all, we will speak sort of project level aspects of design, monitoring, and evaluation. I will provide a small overview. Then we will talk a bit more in detail on outputs and outcomes. We will talk about results frameworks, and I will also delve into some examples. And then Tammy will continue with aspects of monitoring and evaluation, what that looks like in practice. At the project level, and then also we will talk briefly about initiative-wide evaluation. So the whole gender promotion initiative, the youth promotion initiative, and what evaluation looks like for the initiative as a whole. And as always, we will end with questions and answers. So this will be familiar to those who were last week. So we're here last week with a slight change. As always, as we have discussed last week, the starting point for your programmatic intervention should be a conflict analysis. And ideally, then you will formulate peace-building outcomes and work your way back in formulating also outputs that should contribute to these outcomes. And the element of outputs is new this week. We will focus a bit more on this. It wasn't in the presentation last week. And then you will see what kind of activities are necessary to achieve the outputs that you have set yourself to achieve. The flash could also be a sort of symbol for that everything should be connected by a theory of change about which we talked in detail a bit more last week. So with this overview, let's go into some of the details. I have said that one of the new elements we had discussed last week is that we will have to discuss this week are outputs. And since there is often a lot of confusion about some of this terminology, I thought it might make sense to go a bit more in detail about what we mean by outputs and outcomes. So outputs are the tangible deliverables or the immediate results of an activity. So you implement your program, your project through activities, and output is really the immediate result of such an activity. The outputs should be designed in such a way that they contribute to the achievement of an outcome. So all is focused on the achievement of the outcome of your project, and the outputs are one way to get there. Usually there will be multiple outputs that will contribute to an outcome and multiple activities that normally contribute to one output. The way you describe this and the level of detail will depend also on which format you're working. For example, for the concept node, probably there will be a focus on the key outputs that you are trying to achieve. And what we had said in the guidelines is that there should be maximum of 3 to 4 outputs for any given outcome. If you go to a project document, this can go into more detail potentially. And for example, if you are working on a work plan, you will probably be much more specific about activities, about the outputs that are related to these activities, etc. So the level of detail also in the description depends a bit on the format that you're working on. And then finally, One thing that might help you make the distinction between outcomes and outputs is that in the implementation of a project, you still have a fairly high level of control over the achievement of an output. So, for example, if we have a training situation, you have the full control on how you want to deliver the training. So over the activity itself, you as an implementing agency or organization, you have the full control. In the same training, you have any given participants will take away different things from the training. So you still have a fairly high level of control what they will take away, because, for example, if you have a slower training participant, you can give them extra care and attention so they can catch up with the others, etc., etc. So you still have an influence over how you design the process, so that at the end, the output of a number of people trained and that they have the capacities newly acquired through the training, you still have a fairly high degree of control over it, but it's not totally within control, as any given participant in this training will come with different elements to this training, for example. This is one of the reasons, for example, that we also, if you would give us, formulate an output that a new legislation is going to be passed that talks about the improving the equality between different sexes, then we would assume that is a misunderstanding, because given what I have just said, that you still have a fairly high level of control over the achievement of the output, you as an implementing agency, you have very limited control whether any given legislation will actually be passed or not, what content it has, etc. So in this sense, it might be a confusion that you would try to formulate an output at this level. This would rather be something at an outcome level or even further removed. So this is one important element in defining outputs. So let's move on now to outcomes. We've already spoken about outcomes a little bit last week. So outcomes are the desired results or the change affected by your project intervention. So this is really a change that you are trying to achieve, and hence also the focus on theories of change that we have formulated last week, that the basic reason behind any given project is that you want to affect a change in the societies or the localities that you're working in. And they should be captured at the outcome level. At the outcome level is also in the implementation of your project is that you are committing this one or multiple outcomes. In that sense, the outcome is different from further results that are more midterm or long-term, such that are usually captured at the impact level, or what I labeled last week the vision of peace. These are more mid or long-term outcomes that they're further removed. And while we would hold you accountable for achieving the change that you have described at the outcome level, to the impact level, you would only make a contribution. So you would not be fully responsible for achieving the change described at an impact level, or what I labeled vision of peace last week. So to this higher level changes, your project should only make a contribution. But the outcome level is what you are actually fully responsible for achieving. So hence also another reason why the outcome should be formulated very precisely and not something very ambitious, like that you will achieve social cohesion or reconciliation in a nation all by yourself.
In 18 months.
In 18 months. So this is one element of outcomes. And what I've already mentioned as a sort of distinction between outputs and outcomes is that the achievement of an outcome is further removed from your control. If we, for example, formulate an outcome that police would engage differently with youth in hotspots to diffuse tensions, this is the outcome that you're trying to achieve. The way you would go about maybe is that you would train to police in different forms of nonviolent communication, of engaging differently with youth, to get a better understanding of the situation that the youth are in, etc. So you would basically hold a training. And then at the end, the output would be that the police force has the participants that have that took part in this training of the police have a better understanding of these issues. They have new capacities. They have new. They could potentially have different forms of behavior. But this still doesn't diffuse the tensions in these hotspots that you are trying to change as per your outcome. So what is important is that these police use the newly acquired capacities in their daily work, and over this you already have much less control, because this happens outside the training room, etc. So there's intermediate steps, and you could try to work on do sort of an accompaniment or other forms of interventions to really ensure that there is this sort of use of the output that then, if your theory of change is correct, would contribute to the outcome that you have formulated, that it's exactly this lack of capacities or this lack of understanding of engaging with youth in these hotspots that is increasing the tensions. And if everything runs smoothly and your assumptions were correct, so then with the training and the output of these strengthened capacities of these police, and they're actually using these newly acquired capacities in their daily work, you would achieve this outcome. So again, it is further removed. The outcome itself is further removed from your control, but there are still ways for you to see whether you are on track and whether you can provide other forms of interventions or accompaniment that would help you of achieving your outcome.
Actually, before we move on, if I could just also have a little bit of a cautionary message for our UN colleagues on the outcomes issue. So within projects, typically what we see as challenges or potential weaknesses within UN submitted projects, and not just with GPI and YPI, but generally, is the tendency the tendency to assign one outcome per agency. And the whole point of actually trying to do joint work is to harness the power of each of the respective agencies, funds, and programs and their mandates and their expertise, to harness that and pull it together in these sort of multi-sectoral outcomes. So in the example that Salif just gave us, between working with police and working with youth, one can imagine maybe that you would be tapping OHCHR and UNDP and maybe UNFPA or UNICEF in all contributing through different activities and outputs to this common goal. So just a sort of a caution for the UN colleagues to bear in mind, not to divide the pie within one overall proposal. We do want to see truly joint work. And if not, to us, when we read it, it very much looks like separate projects that are more or less stapled together. And that will definitely provide a much weaker standpoint within the overall competition for the resources. Salif, over to you. Sorry.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for going more into detail with this. So the next two slides are a bit of a reminder from last week. I pulled up again some suggestions to formulate good outcomes, good peace-building outcomes. They should be articulated as a desired change. That's already what I highlighted now with the aspect of that outcomes are a desired change and not the immediate result of a project activity. They should be articulated at the right level. That is also giving the sense of the project. And the next point, that there should be clear, realistic, and measurable. So the opposite of being vague will also help you with one thing that is often said, that it is very difficult, supposedly, to find good indicators. And I will come back to this in a bit more detail later. So a good outcome will actually help you with a lot of the tasks that are asked of you in the monitoring and evaluation stage. They should be time-bound, and again, they should be ambitious but achievable. So with this brief overview of some key terms, namely outputs and outcomes, and also ways of differentiating between the two, we move on to the next slide, and we will talk briefly about results, or a bit more in detail actually, about results frameworks. Results frameworks often are sort of the condensed version of what we have talked about as a logical model last week. So they are a sort of snapshot, a summary overview of your project. They present the components of a project or a program, that is what you plan to do in a logical sequence, and they help managers understand the flow of the intervention and detect any gaps or leaps of logic. So especially from our perspective, when we will be receiving now sort of in your submissions, at this stage now, sort of the focus on outcomes and outputs, but then later also in the second phase of the submission, complete logical frameworks. For us, it is a quick entry point in trying to understand the logic of your project. And actually, what we have said at this last point, that it helps detect any gaps or leaps of logic, this is often what we experience in reading projects or project proposals, that it is not clear if you get this snapshot of a project that is condensed into a logical framework, how these things actually connect with another, why there are certain elements in there. You have the impression some key elements might be missing. So it's actually for you a good way to sell your project by having a strong results framework. It should not be considered to be a burden, or it should not only considered to be a sort of resource mobilization or PR tool, but it actually also should help you sort of strengthen the intervention logic of your project, and actually should capture what you are trying to do and make maybe some of the underlying or implicit elements clear, so they are also there for all the people involved in the implementation to have them in front of them and discuss them. So there is no science of results frameworks. There are several elements, and that can also vary from case to case. But what should be included are outcomes and outputs, and I highlighted these in bold now because this is already what we ask for you of you in the submission stage for the first phase, that you provide us a number of outcomes and a number of outputs associated with them. A results framework can include activities. I put this in brackets because in our results framework, as they currently stand, we don't ask for activities within the results framework itself. It should contain indicators. You're not asked to provide indicators at this stage, but in the later stages you will, for those of you who make it to the next round. And there should be means of verification or data sources attached to this, to these indicators. It doesn't make sense to have like the perfect indicator if you are not able to get the necessary data for this. So these should be in a way pragmatic and easily attainable, I would say. Sometimes you should make the extra mile to get some information that would really be helpful to understand some of the results that you are achieving, the changes that you have contributed to, but it should all be in sort of reasonable means. And then another aspect that should be in a results framework are baselines and targets. Those are related to the indicators. So you would, at the beginning of a project, check, okay, regarding this indicator, what is our starting point and where do we want to go? Where do we want to be at the end of the project, which would be your target? The target, again, should be ambitious but realistic, given the time frame, the 18 months of the project, the resources available, etc. So you should not promise, again, there heaven on earth, but things that you can realistically achieve within 18 months, but with a level of ambition. And then we also ask already in the submission for this stage that there's a budget per outcome, and what this helps us to understand is sort of value for money. If we see as part of the outcome, there's a training of 30 people, but this already takes $400,000. Questions of value of money would be raised, and this is one way of detecting some of these potential flaws, but also potential strength with good value for money aspects of the proposition. Let me quickly go back to the indicators in a bit more abstract way before we move to an example. The indicators will be both at the outcome level and the output level. And especially for the outcome level, I've already said that it's often the allegation that it is very difficult to find good indicators for peace building projects, because things such as social cohesion, reconciliation, etc. are difficult to measure. And while this is true, I would also disagree to a certain point in the way that often the problem is that you remain vague or too unspecific in the formulation of your outcome. If you are saying that your project will produce or effect reconciliation in a given locale, it also, for me, sort of violates this rule or this suggestion that your outcome should be specific, and it should refrain from such vague terms and be specific of what reconciliation would look like for you in a given place and time, and how you would want to go about of achieving this. So if you break down what part of reconciliation you will try to achieve in your project, then I think it will also be much lie at the level of the indicators, but it already starts with being too vague at the level of the formulation of the outcome. Okay, if we go to the next slide, it will basically just be some key messages that I've already talked you through regarding the different elements of results framework. So let's move on to the next slide, where we can see this at least partly in action. This would be a little table that will continue on the next slide. But here we have on the left side a formulation of an outcome. Women and girls from conservative religious backgrounds design and lead initiatives to prevent violent extremism in their communities. And I formulated two indicators for this, indicators at the outcome level. So we have an indicator 1 that would state number of women and girls, and then we have disaggregated by age, ethnicity, and community that have developed initiatives funded by the project. So here it is sort of a purely quantitative indicator that we are counting the number of women and girls, and you provide additional information through the disaggregation of this number. So you would have you would provide different you would disaggregate or present different information of the number of girls, how many were maybe minors, how many were in the age bracket between 18 and 30, how many were in the age bracket between 30 and 45, etc., and also by ethnicity and community. Usually one of the disaggregations of indicators also includes disaggregated by sex, to see what is the participation of women and girls in certain activities. Here it is not present because, as you can see in the outcome, only women and girls are targeted to begin with, so disaggregation by sex would not provide any additional information. If we move further to the right, you would see there's a baseline and a target. I assumed here the project would start in mid-September, in mid-2017 and would run for 18 months till the end of 2018. The baseline would be that there are 0 of these people leading comparable initiatives, and the target would be that you have 40 initiatives running by these leaders at the end of the project. Regarding the milestones, they should help you to see whether or not you are on track with this project. So if you have 3 semesters for the project, the assumption here would be that you would have already 20 women and girls leading initiatives by the end of the first semester, and another 20 by the end of the second semester. So the idea would be that you already have 40 initiatives up and running after a year, and that there would be no new initiatives coming in the third semester, but yet you really have a focus in the beginning, and then you have already some sort of implementation of these initiatives throughout the rest of the project. Indicator 2 is a little bit different. So you have these initiatives on the one hand that are led by these women and girls, but then you also have women and girls participating in these initiatives. And what you are trying to achieve maybe through this project is that your conflict analysis has shown that one of the reasons for women and girls to be recruited or to be vulnerable to violent extremism are feelings of exclusion and a lack of agency. So what you are looking at now would be the number of women and girls. Again, you can disaggregate this information that have participated in these locally led community initiatives, and they report increased feelings of inclusion and agency. So here you have not only a quantitative element by the number of women and girls, but you also have a qualitative element in the indicator that shows that these participants show increased feelings of inclusion and agency. Again, you would have a baseline and a target. The baseline would be 0. The target would be 1,200. The assumption would be here something like 30 women and girls would participate per initiative. So if you have 40 initiatives and approximately 30 participants per initiative, then you would come to 1,200. And again, there's a breakdown by semesters regarding the milestones. The idea here would maybe that there is some sort of slower start, that in the first semester you only have 300 participants, but then you have a larger increase in the second semester. Your initiatives are up and running. They really attract a large number of people. And throughout the third semester, you have reached a sort of level of stabilization that the increase is still going on, but not at the level as before. But this is really for you to make clear your assumptions. For example, it could also be the other way around, that you have the impression you're really creating sort of a steamroller that gets that gains more and more traction over time. So you could actually have an even bigger increase towards the third semester and even beyond the duration of your project. It really depends on how you design your project and what are the assumptions underlying some of these elements. You could continue and go further and further in the formulation of indicators. What you have seen, for example, is that we didn't have now an indicator that is focusing directly on the reduction of violent extremism in these communities. the reason for this could be that, for example, that you assume that within these 18 months you will not actually have an impact or a change at this level, that you actually will see a palpable and detectable reduction of cases of violent extremism in the community. But this really depends on how far you want to go in describing the change that you are trying to achieve throughout the project. One thing that is also not here, but as I've talked you already through it, there were some hints of sort of a theory of change underlying the elements in your results framework that could be made explicit as well. And in one of our templates, it is also included at this level. If we move on, an element that then needs to be added would be sort of how do you know whether you achieve your targets, your milestones, and it leads back to what I've said earlier, that you need means of verification. So for each indicator, you would actually need to provide information on how you're actually getting the data to answer the question whether or not the indicator has been achieved at the level of the milestones or the targets. So there could be a number of means of verification. You could have the documentation of the initiatives by the project manager that is overseeing the implementation of the project. There could be field visits to visit these initiatives. There could be reports, photos, videos, etc. for the first indicator. For the second indicator, there could be lists of participants. Again, here it would be important that you actually, these lists include the information that would help you allow to disaggregate these information by age, by ethnicity, by community, etc. And since I also said that there is a qualitative element here in the second indicator regarding the increased feelings of inclusion and agency, there you would actually need to go a bit the extra mile to get the information of this. So what I, just as a suggestion, have made, there could be a perception survey of the participants at the start and at the end of the project activities regarding some of these elements, how they see their position in the community, how they see their level of agency, etc. There could also be focus group discussions. It's really up to you how you get this information. But if sort of this qualitative information is included in the indicator, you would need to provide an answer of how you're going to get this information. So these were now one example of the description of a results framework at the outcome level. You would basically then move on and do the same thing at the output level, and then outputs again related to the outcomes that you have formulated. Here the output, and this is just an example again, women and girls have the knowledge and sense of empowerment to design and lead a community initiative on the prevention of violent extremism. So as you will see from the indicators now, 1 and 2, basically here what will happen is you in the first stage will design a training module that is adapted to the local context, and you will do this in the consultative and participatory way. So this is that you have this training module developed would be the indicator 1. And again, there would be a baseline that you don't have this module to begin with, and the target would be that you have it, and the milestone would be that you already have concluded this preliminary exercise by the end of the 3rd month. The means of verification usually for indicators at the output level tend to be easier than at the outcome level. And usually what we see in projects is that you also struggle less with formulating indicators at the output level, actually to the point that we usually only see indicators at the output level and not at the outcome level. Indicator 2 would be number of women and girls trained on prevention of violent extremism, leadership, and women's rights. So it would be sort of a putting into practice using the module that you have developed and conducting these trainings, again with baselines. The assumption here would be that probably you train a bit more people than you actually think will go through with actually leading one of these initiatives later on. So instead of the 40 initiatives that you're aiming at, each headed by one woman or a girl, you would train 60, so you have a bit of extra, so to speak. One thing that would be interesting to discuss here is the sort of means of verification again. It goes back to what I've said earlier about sort of the quality of the output. So you could, on the one hand, just provide a participants list saying, okay, we have trained 60 girls and women, but it would actually be interesting to see, have they actually learned something? Do they have increased capacities? Do they know about these things that you are trying to teach them about violent extremism? Do they have the leadership skills, etc.? And there could be also means of trying to capture this, but there again, you would have to go the extra mile. You could do pre and post tests of these participants in the trainings to see whether they have increased knowledge. You could do little focus group with some of these participants to see what is their what are their increased capacities, how do they report back on this, to actually see what is the actual knowledge increase. And with this, I hand over to Tammy.
Okay, actually just a little footnote on the pre and the post testing. So as Philippe was saying, you could do, like a sort of knowledge survey of your participants in something before they enter into whatever training or workshop, and then, before they leave the door, physically leave, like you test them again, did they get it? But it's also extremely interesting, I think, to do that, but then, as Philippe said, go the extra mile, and then go a little bit later after the training to see in their places of either work, like if you're training police, for example, or in the case of the women, as they go out into their communities, where would you be expecting them to apply this change or apply these new skills, and see if they are actually applying the new skills. Because it may also be that although we thought that training was the issue, maybe there are other barriers to people being able to actually achieve the desired outcome that will then need to contribute to an output to an outcome. Sorry. So anyway, before shifting over into looking at project level monitoring, just a quick reminder that if you have any questions as we're going along, please put them in the chat, and we are sort of collecting those as we go along, and we can address those after my sort of 3 short slides remaining. And then the only other sort of overarching comment is that just be aware that although we're going into this level of detail now, we're really expecting these kinds of fleshed out, detailed, concrete outcomes and indicators for the outcomes to be there at the full project stage. So at the level of the concept note, we don't expect that you're able to sort of delineate every possible, 100% lockdown indicator for all of these different project levels. What we do want to see, however, are really well-articulated outcomes, and then the outputs, a sort of sketch of the outputs that will contribute to those, so that we can actually see, given the problem statement that you've outlined, how you're going to approach addressing that problem.
And maybe if I can add to that, to prevent further questions on that. So in the online application, what we had just talked about, you'll be asked that information in that question regarding the 3 project outcomes that you're supposed to list, then the estimate budget per outcome of that outcome, the estimate of the amount allocated to gender equality and women's empowerment, as well as then the up to 4 outputs for each outcome. So that's the basic information that we would like you to provide during this initial stage 1 online application.
Okay, and with that, and with the acknowledgement that if you don't have indicators, then actually coming up with your monitoring framework doesn't make sense, everything that I'm about to sort of go through now around monitoring and evaluation presupposes that you already have a fully fledged project. Okay, so at the project level monitoring, we just wanted to highlight a couple of things to bear in mind. One is that, as we've been trying to stress all along, really the strongest projects that will approach monitoring and evaluation actually, but for the purposes of this slide, monitoring, they'll approach this recognizing the sort of dual purpose or dual function of monitoring. I think the primary thing is that it'll help you as managers be able to monitor what it is that you're doing and to see the progress, to recognize if things are actually working, to apply those lessons elsewhere in the project. If they're not working, then also to be trying to look for the reasons why and to course correct before it's too late. We don't need to burn through all of the time and all of the funds for the project to discover that we should have changed something earlier. The other purpose, of course, is for accountability, so that we, for example, at the fund and our donors, are able to see what you have been able to accomplish with the investment that we've made in your work. So really, it has these twofold purposes of better project management and enhanced accountability. For that enhanced accountability and for the project management, though, you need, as Salif was saying earlier, baseline data to be able to account for the progress. If you don't know where your starting point is, you won't really know how to interpret ongoing data collection throughout the project. So you won't really know if things are being, your initiatives are successful or not. And here, I mean, I don't want to go too much into a detail for an anecdote, but I was working in a country context several years ago where a health colleague came to me at annual reporting time and said, we had fantastic outcomes on, let's just say, children's under 5 health outcomes. And I said, well, that's terrific. How do you know that they were really good outcomes? And she said, well, we improved by 15% over what the prior data collection had been. And it just so happened that an NGO that was working not in the areas that we had been working, but were doing substantially the same things in different areas, had a 25% improvement. And so with that, I was also able to sort of go back to her and say, like, look, you know, between 25% and 15%, I think we have some questions here. And it doesn't mean that 15% was bad or that it wasn't as good as it could be. It just means that for that area, because we didn't have the baseline data, we didn't really know how to interpret the 15%. Was it good? Should we have been at the 25% that the NGO was able to get? We just didn't know. So you need the baseline data. In terms of data collection and the sort of resources needed for monitoring, the first step after you have a finalized results framework with the indicators is to identify the available data versus that which must be collected by you. So there are some routine data collection exercises that are ongoing. There is regular administrative data in many of the countries that you may be also able to pull from. And there's also like the ongoing project data, whether you're holding a training at the output level, for example, the way of counting how many people were involved or trying to measure them through a knowledge survey afterwards, that is going to be fairly inexpensive. But for the other kinds of outcomes, like perception changes, for example, invest a little bit of money and a little bit of time, particularly for baselines and end lines. We would ask that after the baseline data, throughout the course of the project, you look at the duration of the project, and then you plan your data collection to coincide with reporting or other sort of reflective moments. If you're doing a midterm evaluation on your own, for example, you'll want fresh data for that exercise so that you're actually able to to reflect with the most recent accomplishments or the most recent challenges. And then finally, given the implementation timeframe, project-specific data collection, like the perception surveys that I just mentioned, it's likely only for the baseline and the end line. These things are generally expensive, and they are also challenged, like they require a certain amount of work on the part of your staff to launch. So given these sort of heavier processes, they're likely over the course of an 18 to 24-month project only for the baseline and the end line. Okay, so that's monitoring, and then if we shift over to its cousin, evaluation, we have project level evaluation, and the main thing here is that all projects need to plan and budget for a final independent evaluation. And in terms of budgeting, if your project is $1 million, for example, we will not look kindly upon a budget for an evaluation that is $5,000 to $10,000. This is not commensurate with the sort of degree or the scope of your project. And in fact, in almost, I can't think of any country in which we're working, especially given the challenges, the sort of physical challenges in many of the countries that we're working, where $5,000 or $10,000 is sufficient for a quality final evaluation. So you need to not just budget for an evaluation, but budget sufficiently for it. Quality evaluations rely on good data and good reporting throughout the project implementation. So the connection with what I was just mentioning on monitoring, the monitoring will help with your own project management, it will help with accountability, and it will also support stronger, higher quality evaluation at the end, which will also improve and underpin learning. And then finally, there is some support when projects have been approved, and these projects then are winding down and looking for to sort of launch or to procure evaluators for a final evaluation. We really ask you to reach out and work with us here in New York and or with the PBF secretariats in places where we have secretariats to help define the terms of reference. Because in particular with Peacebuilding evaluations, they're quite different from standard development evaluations. And if we're not explicitly capturing the sort of peace-building elements within the terms of reference for an evaluation, we may, and we have routinely in the past, gotten evaluations that have told us, for example, on, let's say, the ones that come to mind right now are about employment and peace-building. We may hear a lot about the success of a livelihoods project or an employment project. And that's great. I mean, it's wonderful that the employment worked, but from our perspective, did employment actually contribute to any kind of peace-building outcome? And if that's not built into the terms of reference, that learning and that accountability will remain obscure, and we won't actually be able to use that evaluation for the purposes of understanding the contribution to peace-building. So that's at the level of the project evaluation. We also, just to sort of bear in mind why we spend so much time sort of focusing on project level evaluations, and it's because we're using your project level evaluations to contribute to broader learning exercises that we conduct and we procure here at PBF in New York. Now, the first one is for the GYPI work. This is, of course, the fourth initiative that we're running. And so it will be contributing to an ongoing series of learning initiatives throughout the past now more than 6 years. So 3 years ago, PBF and PBSO did a gender thematic review that pulled from some of the evaluations that we were doing here. And we had then committed with our GYPI 2 and 3 that we would, with our final evaluations, we would then be updating the gender thematic review through a meta-evaluation. That will be launched sometime this year, and we don't anticipate the results maybe until the end of this year or the beginning of next year. So we anticipate that we will be having these sorts of regular thematic reviews every 3 or so years. And so the projects that will be approved for this round of funding will be contributing to learning in the next phase of meta-evaluation. Similarly, youth promotion initiatives, which have only been, this is the second time that we're doing this. The projects that are approved in this round of funding will join those from last year's initiatives. And we will then collect all of the evaluations at the individual project level and pool them into a meta-evaluation for youth. And then that will also help feed the ongoing monitoring and learning on implementation of Resolution 2250. So before I leave it here, I also just wanted to mention, in some instances in your countries, when it comes time to evaluate your project, there may be an ongoing evaluation of PBF work in your country. So perhaps there was a package of IRFs that are separate from this Gender and Youth Promotion Initiative, or perhaps there is a programmatic PRF, and maybe there is an evaluation that is being planned. We've oftentimes received the question, can we just be lumped in with that evaluation and save the resources? And the answer is no. And the answer is no for two reasons. First, for this purpose that I just mentioned about the learning and the pulling in evaluations into one big meta-evaluation. But the second, more sort of substantive reason is that we have made decisions around funding for these projects based on a set of criteria. Similarly, we made decisions around funding for our PRF countries, for example, based on a strategic plan that was agreed to with other stakeholders and sort of had a different sense of logic to it. So that the driving purposes behind our funding and the sort of strategic aims that that funding was meant to address are essentially different. And so this is why we don't sort of combine evaluation exercises. So just to underscore, even if you know that there is a broader portfolio-wide evaluation being planned in your country by PBF, you still, as a project within the GYPI and the YPI, are obligated to do a project-level evaluation. I hope that's clear. Okay, so with that, I think we'll turn over to some of the questions.
So maybe before we answer some of the questions, Tammy, you could say how detailed the M&E part should be answered.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you, for example, I just got done saying that you won't have your actual indicators identified, and so we won't get a sense of the sort of specific things that you are going after in terms of a data collection exercise, for example. But you will know the sort of general thrust of the issues that you're trying to address, the peace-building challenges you are trying to help improve, the capacities that you're trying to help underpin. And so we would like to hear from you, like your sort of overall thoughts on where you would expect to be monitoring and with what frequency you would be expected to monitor to achieve, to sort of track progress on these overarching ideas that you're presenting to us. We just want to hear that you're thinking about it, that you are not just sort of putting it off until the last moment and checking a box that it's done, but that it actually is an integral part of your project design and your thinking about implementation. Yeah, and typically we, in our guidelines around project formulation, we recommend that 5 to 7% of the overall budget be dedicated to monitoring and evaluation. Okay, so I see some questions coming in, and I'll begin to address those as Salif and Ruth also capture some of the others that may not be at the bottom of our screen. So can I please clarify the first meta-evaluation has been published? No. So we have not, what is published online on the PBSO website is the gender thematic review that was done, I think, roughly 3 years ago. And then this year, we will be launching, meaning we will start procuring and then managing a meta-evaluation after all of the final evaluations from the GPI 1 and 2 have been submitted to us. So we can't really begin that meta-evaluation until we have all of the underpinning project evaluations. There are still a handful of those that are remaining to be finalized. And so once those are done, we'll be able to launch the meta-evaluation. Again, we expect that by the end of the year into the beginning of next year. And that will be then published on our website, as are all of our evaluations at the pbf.org, not the GPI, YPI website, but our normal PBF website. You can find them under Documents, and then under the Documents tab, there is a specific one for evaluation. Yeah, can I give an idea how much to budget for a good independent evaluation? Yeah. Again, like the recommendation for both monitoring and evaluation is 5 to 7%. And I mean, I think the amounts of the evaluation do, of course, vary from country to country, depending on what the sort of the overall costs of living and the overall costs for these kinds of exercises in different countries. So it's hard to say that, is $40,000 sufficient for a project evaluation? Is $75,000 sufficient? Is $30,000? That actually does depend on your own country context and the scope of the work that you are doing. But again, we would ask if we're looking at a proposal, and again, it is sort of woefully under that sort of 5 to 7% threshold, or again, like the budget for the evaluation is extremely small, particularly if your overall project is quite large, like $1 million. And we have seen this in the past where people come to us and say at the very end, well, we have $7,000 left.
Whether you are actually held accountable for achieving the outcome or whether you're only contributing to the outcome. And that was the understanding, the latter was the understanding of one of the participants. In the way I have described it, it is actually that we would hold you accountable for achieving the outcome. Again, hence the need for being specific on what you are trying to achieve, what is the change that you are trying to effect. And then it can be rendered a bit more specific than later on with the baselines and the targets, where that might not be necessarily already formulated at this stage, but to give us a rough idea at least, that in the example that I've given, of course, it would be a difference if you plan to have 3,000 initiatives up and running versus 40. That would change the scope of the project, but nonetheless, it is what you present in the outcome is that what we actually expect for you to achieve by the end of the project. Then these changes that you effect will have, hopefully, if your theory of change is good, a contribution to more medium and long-term change at the what I would call impact level, which is something that we don't ask you to formulate as part of the project document, neither at this stage nor at the second stage. But you should be accountable for achieving the outcome that you set out in your description of the project. Another question related to activities and why there are no activities in the results framework. In the current version of our results framework, we have not included activities just for the reason of, I would say, efficiency, or also space, sorry, in the sense that we often already have results frameworks that are several pages of a work document, and by listing all the activities would only blow this up further. So often if the outputs are very well formulated, you can get a grasp of what the activities actually are that are related to these outputs. So we rather encourage you, as part of a results framework for the second stage of the submission, to really focus on formulating strong outputs. As part of the concept note, you are asked to at least detail some key activities. There I would not go too much into detail, but it would really be sort of more the sort of general thrust of your project. Is it going to be trainings? Is it going to be dialogue fora that you're going to create and accompany? Is it going to be employment and income generating activities, etc.? Just providing really sort of the key elements in terms of the activities without going to like a sequence detail of, I would first recruit a number of people to participate in this, and then they will meet bi-weekly. It's really sort of the general idea of what the activities are, instead of like going into the level of details of the work plan, I would say. Again, the question is now, how many activities are normally listed? I think if you focus on what I've just said on what are the key activities, it's more sort of the type of activities than the number. So if you're mainly doing trainings, then it's only basically one key activity, trainings. You probably do more than just one activity, but really try to describe the nature of your intervention and the key elements of your intervention, instead of going into a laundry list of everything that you're going to do. So there's more, again, about the quality of what you write than about the level of the quantity of the information that you're going to provide.
Okay, so there was also another question about the flexibility. Is there any flexibility on reformulating outcomes or outputs at the proposal stage? So if a concept note has been accepted for development or invited to develop a full proposal, is there flexibility on being able to reformulate that? And the answer is yes, to a degree. So when we here at PBSO, after the closing date, the deadline for the concept notes, we will hold a project appraisal committee where together a number of colleagues will sort of consider each project mission. And if your project is then invited, as part of the project appraisal committee, we collect comments and sort of observations around the strengths and the weaknesses of the project. So, I mean, we do actually anticipate that some of the outcome language, for example, may be detailed or tweaked, somehow improved, hopefully, on the basis of the comments that you get or the feedback that you get from the project appraisal committee. If, however, we see a wholesale change within the outcomes, that I think will be grounds for not passing into the next round, because in essence you will have violated the concept note, the terms of concept note that got you into that final round of funding. And since this is a competitive process, it would be a sort of unfair advantage to allow people or organizations to have like a complete change of their outcomes. So improvement of what you already have there, or sort of a refining of what you already have as an outcome in the same spirit, yes. but changing the actual thrust or the content of it, no. I hope that's clear.
It seems that this whole question about outcomes and how accountability is still sparking more questions. There has been a question now that says, in peace building, we tend to consider outcomes as within our sphere of influence, but not within our sphere of control. This is basically mirrors a bit what I had said, that there is a decreasing level of control over the outcome if you compare it to the output. So in that regard, we agree it's not 100% in your control whether or not you achieve the outcome. There we are on the same page. Where I would disagree slightly, the question continues, in peace building, especially in fragile contexts, we can often not predict whether the outputs actually will contribute in a predictable and linear fashion to the outcomes. There I also still agree, it doesn't have to be linear, but there needs to be some sort of predictability in the sense what relates back to what we have discussed about the theories of change. If you are just like shooting in the barrel of fish and hoping to hit something, that is not, I would consider this not to be sort of underpinned by a strong theory of change. There should be a level of predictability based on the assumptions that you have formulated in your theory of change. So I would also, for this reason, disagree with your conclusion that not to be too detailed on the outcomes. There again, I would stress, and I would also doubt, as the comment continues, that this is best practice to be vague on the outcomes. On the contrary, I would underline very specific on the outcomes that you are trying to achieve. When it comes to accountability, it means at least that at the end of the project you will be asked whether or not you have achieved the outcome, and there might be reasons why you have not achieved fully the outcome, but there will be the question. This question will be asked, and what concrete change your project has affected. And it will not only be at the level, okay, we were hoping to make some sort of contribution to a change, and this might or might not have happened.
I think part of the question, too, may have been getting at a different way of approaching sort of more like a developmental evaluation or outcome harvesting approach than what it is that we are asking for within this GPI, YPI, like at least in terms of the overall structure of the online application. So, I mean, I think the only time in which the outcomes typically are a little bit, as you would say, vague or not too detailed, I think are in the times when you're working in super highly contingent environments where outcomes are not necessarily known. So, for example, we oftentimes fund work around mediation, like in Yemen, we're supporting high-level mediation around the cessation of hostilities and a peace agreement. So when we're funding that, we obviously we're not able to anticipate if and when those mediation efforts may bear fruit. So it's hard for us to sort of set really clear outcomes, but we do actually ask them to at least state clearly what they hope for, and then we also then build in really tight and robust monitoring along the way, and embed an evaluator within that team so that they can be doing a sort of developmental evaluation where periodically they are harvesting the outcomes that are emerging through the ongoing project implementation. That is an extremely labor-intensive practice. And probably, I mean, if you are going in that direction, I would say bear in mind that your outcome needs to be specified to a level of detail that we have confidence in what it is that we are funding. We have to be able to see what it is that you're proposing. We have to be able to sort of have a good sense of how you're going to approach the accomplishment of that thing. And then building in sort of these other sort of measures sort of heightened measures of monitoring in order to be able to shift or to revise your approach if you need to because of deeply contingent environments. But those, and that may be an appropriate strategy for the thing that you're seeking to do, but just a caution, don't be super vague on the outcome because you'll never actually make it to the next stage because we won't be able to understand what it is that you're trying to do. Okay.
Another maybe related question in a way has been about indicators, and it has been stated that we have mainly been focusing on indicators that are focusing or trying to capture a change that has been affected, and at the outcome level this certainly has been true. So far it's an adequate description of what I have said. And it has been stated that there might be indicators that are more focused on process. And yeah, if we would have more time, we probably would have delved into that also with some detail. So while we have focused now on indicators that describe a certain change, you could indeed have indicators that are more related to a certain process. And to going back to what we have just discussed about the formulation of the outcome and what Tammy had mentioned regarding these mediation or dialogue processes where the actual result is not very clear, you could actually go back and say, okay, maybe what is more important here is how the process is designed. That, for example, it is inclusive of all the main parties to a conflict. That all the parties have the same possibility to participate actively in this effort of mediation or dialogue. That they have similar possibilities to voice their opinions and their views on certain topics. So this would not actually talk about what is the result of this mediation process, but more of the process. And then you could actually have indicators that are related to this process, namely on inclusivity, on the way this process is managed, etc., which would be another way of going at it, which would be just as good, depending on how appropriate a more process focus is towards a more change-oriented focus of a project. Yes, there could be indicators more focused on process, instead of focused on the actual change, which would be also acceptable. There had been another question on budgets per outcome and the questions of level of ambition, of value for money, etc. If there's no fully fledged description of activities, etc., whether we can still get the information that we would need out of such a description. I would say, since you are asked to provide us with a number of outcomes and then a number of outputs per outcome, if you give us a ballpark figure for the budget per outcome, we still, I would say, get at least an idea whether your proposition falls within the parameters of what we would still consider value for money. Because this is not like just one point on, but it's more a continuum or a range. And we don't actually have concrete numbers for this, but it would just be sort of by reading your proposition that we would say, oh, this seems a bit unlikely why they would spend so much money if they only in the end are going to affect 10 people. So there's a more a way of excluding maybe some of the propositions that sound a bit out of the ballpark and not really already determining once and for all, yes, this is great value for money, because for this the level of information is just not detailed enough. There was another question regarding indicators and so-called smart indicators, especially with the T in smart, the time indicators being time-bound. I mean, since we are talking here about 18 months project, the time frame is pretty clear. And since we don't ask you to provide any indicators at the sort of impact level of what I've said, where you're only making a contribution to wider changes in the society that might actually come into effect only long after your project has ended. The question about the time element is maybe not so crucial and does not necessarily have to be included in the formulation of the indicator. What I had shown in the examples a bit with the targets and the milestones, you have a little bit of a breakdown over time. And I think this, for the exercise as it stands, for the second phase of the submission, this would be more than enough actually of what we would ask for.
So I have a couple more. Actually, one is actually on this question of like quantitative indicators versus qualitative indicators. I also wanted to throw in the mix because also there was a question that we received on the chat about do we have any guidance around goal level indicators? So I don't know if you mean like sort of outcome level or impact level, but we actually, so we don't have like a list of suggested indicators per theme. We don't have that kind of guidance, but we would say keep in mind around at least outcomes or overarching goals for overall projects that we want to see something that goes beyond just the increased capacity of something or the like things that normally would be considered, I think, outputs. So we build capacity for what purpose? To see some sort of other kind of change. And it's that kind of change that we're looking at at the higher level. And so when we come to trying to identify indicators, we would then be looking for indicators that try to capture that higher level change, not just, you know, did women's capacity to engage local decision makers increase? But in that instance, we would actually be looking at the sort of quality of participation eventually of the women, or if the quality of decisions in the end are more inclusive at the local level, or the attitude of local leaders, has that shifted? These are the sort of higher level, impact level indicators that we'd be looking for such a goal. But one kind of interesting thing that I should have maybe mentioned in terms of the monitoring bit, I noted before that there may be different kinds of routine data collection, either from regular surveys that happen or from administrative data from the state that they normally collect. But there are also, and then of course the perception surveys or other kinds of surveys that you may procure for your specific purposes. There is another sort of class, in addition to also big data, which I don't want to necessarily get into right now, because I think it's still a kind of relatively new area and still somewhat expensive to organize for. The I think very fruitful and inexpensive place to go is also to try to look at what is the so-called everyday peace building indicators. And there have been a number of organizations that have done some really, I think, interesting, innovative work at looking at just sort of observable indicators in your everyday world. And the one that's leaping to mind the most is a kind of cool indicator on the reduction or people's confidence or hope in the future and hope in a peace agreement. Instead of going and asking people, are you hopeful or how do you feel about the peace agreement? An everyday peace building indicator might be in a certain area. It was suggested how many houses are being rebuilt or have a fresh coat of paint. Because chances are no one's going to invest in these sort of improvements if you expect the building to be damaged by fighting very soon after. So, you know, that actually by taking a little bit more of an anthropological approach, you may be able to reduce the cost of measuring or data collection, and at the same time actually get at some really sensitive and more kind of behavioral examples. because they're also, and they could also work nicely in tandem with the perception indicators. So people may declare that they are hopeful, but are they actually, do you see evidence of that in their normal everyday lives? And vice versa. It may be that the practice that they're doing, their behavior, demonstrates a kind of behavior change, but when you ask them, their perception still lags behind. So it's important to sort of be measuring, especially at that higher outcome level, in different ways, through both quantitative, qualitative, but through perception as well as sort of behavior change. And then one last final point, the question by one of our participants is, they have a draft results framework. How can it be somehow attached or embedded at this stage? And the answer is, I think, well, in terms of attachment, it cannot, because there's no means of attaching anything to the online portal. And I think I would ask that, I mean, it's terrific that you already are able to anticipate a draft results framework. I think that will strengthen your proposal overall at this initial stage, this online application. And I would just use that to be as clear and as focused as possible with the questions, the series of questions that are being asked of this online application, and save the results framework, the draft results framework, for later if you're invited to develop a full proposal. So there really isn't any window within the online application portal for including a draft results framework. And if you try to embed it within one of the existing windows, you're going to be doing it at the expense of actually giving us information that we've asked for. And so you will be undermining your own proposal. And we won't be able to evaluate it against other proposals in the same way. So again, use that information, the level of planning and specificity that you already have. Use that as a sort of launch pad to improve on the responses to the questions that we're asking. And then you already have, if you're successful in this stage, you already are like 2 steps down the path of developing the results framework. So I hope that's clear.
So maybe if I can add to that, also just to say that we expect a very high number of applications, and so the information that we're asking at this very first stage of the application process is very well thought through, and we also do not want any more additional information. So, which leads us also to the question that a couple of you asked, whether or not there is a word or character limit for the different fields. We explained that during the past couple of webinars as well. There is none. However, I mean, as we expect so many applications, we will certainly prefer those that manage to answer in a concise and to the point manner over those that are repetitive and lengthy. So this is not a novel. So we really hope that you help us here in really understanding your proposal and what you're aiming at, in putting it in a very concise and precise manner.
On n'approche même pas la fin de la session, on l'a déjà dépassé, mais j'encourage quand même la possibilité de poser aussi des questions en français si c'est nécessaire. Entre-temps, there has been one question that we have not answered yet. It was about the disaggregation by ethnicity, and that this could be sensitive in a given context and actually create more problems that it's going to solve. I totally agree. You should be careful in the way you collect data for your monitoring and evaluative exercises. And of course not go out and increase tensions where you're actually trying to resolve them. On the other hand, it also depends on how you get the information. And there are different ways to going about this. And for example, if you are planning to do activities that are inclusive, that bridge the gap between different communities, you have a dialogue platform in which members of different communities participate, there should be a way of you for also knowing that you actually do have a representation in the room of members of different communities. And this would basically all we would be asking at the level of disaggregation, when and where it makes sense. It doesn't have to be a standard thing that I have proposed in the results framework. It was just to show you this possibility of disaggregating data, and that there might be places where this makes sense.
Okay, and the final question is a very kind of like nuts and bolts question regarding the percentage of the budget. So what percentage do we recommend for staff and office costs? So we don't have any hard and fast percentages around this, in part because there's a bit of a difference in the way that the UN approaches this versus the way that NGOs are structured. And so we're trying to be sensitive to the different kinds of applicants that we will have. I think as a general rule, however, I know it's not very helpful to say that they shouldn't be too high, but yeah, they shouldn't be too high. I'm sorry. If we have a sense that your organization will be relying on funding from this initiative in order to stay afloat, chances are that degree of support for your overall operations will undermine both your proposal as well as your ability, if you're an NGO, to make it through the vetting system that our fund administrator will be sort of reflecting on if you've been invited to develop to a full proposal. So with the UN in general, we support, of course, staff that are directly related to the management of the project. Of course, we cover that. For the other kinds of operating costs, however, we do not. And so, yeah, we assume that the UN office is supporting itself, and that all that is needed is really just the sort of specific initiative project costs.
Actually, it's two. In French or in English, and whether there could be a switch between the stage 1 online application language and then the full project proposal, if successful. We don't have specific guidelines for that. However, we would say, so as you can submit in French and English, whatever makes most sense in the country of your project proposal, that's what we would prefer, because at the end of the day, if you submit your proposal for Burundi in French, it will help you and make it easier for you when you reach to the actual final stage and have to fill out the full project template, because you will need the signature of the government. And I doubt that the capacities in English will be
Yeah, and a sort of like little insider pragmatic note on that as well is that not within our team here, those who will be participating in the project appraisal committee, we have a mix of both French speakers and non-French speakers. So for example, if you submitted the online initial application in English, you may have had a series of English-only speakers and readers within the project appraisal committee assessing your project. And if your project made it to the next level, it means that there was a lot of support for it. So if you switch to French, you may be, in a way, excluding some of your biggest cheerleaders when it comes to considering the full project. So I would say stick with the sort of more pragmatic approach would be to stick with the language of submission from the first to the second stage, both for the reasons that Breeze was mentioning, as well as for this kind of internal unique situation on the part of PBF.
And the second question was how many proposals will expect to move on to the second stage. That we really don't have a number or a limit for that. So it really depends on how many high quality proposals we get. And we'd be happy to see as many high quality proposals moving on to the second stage. And just as a side note, in the past and during the previous couple of years, it's always been the other way around, that we did not even reach our funding target because we did not receive enough high quality proposals to even be able to fund all of them and to fund the total amount of money that we had foreseen for this initiative.
So I guess with that, I think we're winding down on the questions. We will try to follow up at least with some of them, also with some posting on the website to address some of the recurring questions that we get. And we come actually to the end, not just of this webinar, but of the overall webinar series. And so for those of you who have joined us, especially those of you who have joined us throughout, and in particular, to those of you who have joined from time zones that make it incredibly difficult or challenging for you, we really appreciate your attendance. We hope that it's been helpful. We wish you all the best in the development of the online proposals. We remind you again that the deadline is the 7th. It's next Friday. And so we're coming down to the very, very end. Best of luck. And yeah, please, just for your own benefit, do not wait until the very last moment to try to upload your proposal. The website may slow down. If everyone tries to do it, it may actually even crash. So if you want to be absolutely 100% sure that your project has been submitted on time, please, please do not wait until the last minute.